Here's Father Dan Daly.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you. I have great admiration for this group. You do great work, sharing the spirituality of St. Ignatius and helping people grow in their faith lives and helping yourself grow in your faith life. So it's good to be with you here today. So I'm going to, Steve indicated, offer a few reflections. First, talk on imagination, how that can help us connect with Jesus, and then a second talk on the two standards. Steve said I'm from Denver, went to Regis High School and Regis University, the Jesuit institutions out there, joined the Jesuits, went through the long training program and was ordained in 1992. And then after that did graduate work in accounting and ended up teaching for a number of years. But it was sort of inevitable with the background in accounting. I was going to end up being the province treasurer, and so that's what I am, and I've been that for a number of years and enjoying that. I'm grateful for the opportunity just to put a few ideas together. It gives me a chance just to focus in and reflect on it a little bit more. And so I'll offer some insights, but it's not going to be the final word. All of you are familiar with the spiritual exercises. You've made the spiritual exercises. You help direct others in those. And all of you have your own insights and understandings. So I hope what I say today might just provide a different perspective or maybe enrich some understanding you already have. So let's start with following Jesus using imaginative prayer. I start by saying that my focus will be on contemplation of gospel stories. So there are other forms of imaginative prayer. And so certainly in the spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius encourages us to use imagination in other ways, like the meditation on the two standards or other forms of imaginative prayer. And of course, outside the exercises, folks like Tony DeMello and others provide some imaginative exercises that can help us connect with Jesus and help us grow closer to God. And those are terrific. But contemplation of gospel stories is the type of imaginative prayer I'm most familiar with. And I think it's a rich area for growing in our relationship with Jesus. And so that's the area I wanted to speak about today. So the plan is I'll talk a little bit about gospel stories and why I think gospel stories are so important, and then talk about contemplation as a way of sitting with a gospel story and drawing some meaning from that story. Talk a little bit about imagination and the bad rap that imagination gets, but how important it is in contemplation and connecting with those stories. Offer a few practical tips, just some thoughts I have on using the imagination in contemplation and in prayer. Then talk specifically about putting ourselves in the scene, and so that's a form of contemplation where we actually are one of the characters, and some thoughts on that, and then just conclude with some observations about how God can speak to us through the imagination. So first, gospel stories. I think stories are really important. Storytelling is a very human thing to do. We enjoy telling stories, we enjoy listening to stories, and we come to understand things through stories. You know, description and explanation are helpful, but I think stories can add an additional dimension, an additional layer to that, and help us understand things even better. And they're rich. There's a lot that can be contemplated on. And stories touch our head and they touch our heart, and you can look at them from various angles. So I think they're really a rich source in our lives and in our faith. Family stories are important to us. Family stories help us know who we are, tell us something about ourselves, and help connect us with the other members of our families. And we all have family stories that we share, and when someone new comes into the family, we share those stories with them so they could establish the same connection. So if we wanted to tell someone about our families, chances are we wouldn't give them just a description. We'd tell them a few stories, and that helps them understand our families and our relationship with our families. And I think we like stories in general because we all have our own stories, and other stories resonate with our stories and tell us something about friendship or courage or hope that resonate with our own experience. And I think that can be very helpful. And so gospel stories are a special treasury of stories for those of us who are Christian. And I think those too resonate with our own experience. Jesus, of course, was a great storyteller, and he told stories about wandering sheep and annoying neighbors and devious employees and all sorts of other stories. And they're memorable and they're fun, and they were passed down from one generation to the next until gospel writers wrote them down. And that was probably the most important form of teaching that Jesus did, was in stories. He'd offer instruction or explanation on occasion, but more often than not, when he had something important he wanted to tell us, he would tell us a story that could resonate with our stories to live by. So stories were very important for Jesus. And we could spend a lot more time just talking about parables and how effective they are as a teaching device. And then, of course, there are stories about Jesus, all sorts of stories, and the gospel writers want to share those stories with us. And so they help us get to know Jesus. Faith is a relationship with God. It's a relationship with Jesus. And one of the ways we build that relationship is talking to Jesus about our lives, sharing with Jesus our own experiences and our own ups and downs in life. But another important way of connecting with Jesus is to allow Jesus to share his life with us and get to know him better and understand his life. And one of the primary ways we get to do that is through the stories about him. So that brings us to contemplation. St. Ignatius invites us to sit with stories for a while. Don't just read them quickly and move on, but just to sit with them. And I think that's what he's recommending in the different forms of prayer. And I think we have an experience of that, of just stories in general. We like to sit with them. We don't just tell them quickly. We sit with them and ponder them a while. I think of a family story of my mother and grandfather closing down their family home in Wisconsin and making a big move out to Denver. And there was all sorts of reasons for doing that. But and they enjoyed, when my grandfather was still living, they enjoyed telling those stories. And one would tell a bit of the story and the other would chime in from their perspective. And then my aunt, who was living in Denver at the time and was a big part of the reason they moved out to Denver in the first place, would share the story from her angle and what she was doing out in Denver and how she heard about the big move and so forth. And then members of the family would ask questions and so forth. So it's a way of just sitting with the story, enjoying it, letting that story sink in. And Ignatius thought it was good just to sit with stories for a while, and he suggested ways of doing that. And one is meditation, right? We just read through the story slowly and just ponder it. And if something strikes us, we just sit with it and think about it for a while. We don't worry about getting through the whole end of the story and finishing it up. If something strikes us, just sit with it and ponder that for a while. And so that's a way of sitting with a gospel story. And contemplation is a way of sitting with gospel stories. We just, in contemplation, we put ourselves in the middle of the scene and we notice what's going on and we see the characters and we notice the setting and hear the sounds, the music and the conversation or whatever's going on. And we have a sense of the people around us, of the crowd that's gathering. It's a way of sitting with the story. We notice the setting. We notice expression on people's faces. We hear conversations. We follow the basic outline of the story as included in the Gospels, but then we fill in some of the details with our imagination to help bring those stories to life. Contemplation is just spending time with the story, letting that story sink in, imagining the different aspects of the stories. And contemplation, as many of us have experienced, can be a powerful way of connecting with that story and connecting with Jesus. So let's say a little bit about imagination. I think imagination sometimes gets a bad rap, and people say that imagination is really opposed to reality, and if we want to connect with reality, we just ought to stick with the facts and not be imagining all sorts of things. Well, certainly imagination can allow us to explore worlds of fantasy. And so, Star Wars or Avenger series are very fanciful, very imaginative, and allows us to connect with these fantasy worlds. And those are great, and those are entertaining, but I don't think we're likely to confuse those with reality. But imagination can also help us connect with reality. So if someone comes back from a vacation in Hawaii and is telling us about the beautiful sand on the shore and the blue water and the pineapple drinks, and they're relating their experience, and as they're describing it, we're imagining it. We're picturing it in our mind. Even if they're not showing us pictures from their phone, we can kind of see it just from their description of it. And that can help us connect with the reality of their vacation. By imagining it, by filling in the details, by seeing the pictures, that can help us connect with it. And it brings the story to life. And it doesn't matter if we get all the details exactly right. We don't know exactly how many palm trees were on the beach there, or what straws were in the pineapple drink, but it doesn't really matter. Those are just some details that are added to bring it to life a little bit. And those details really aren't important. We understand the meaning of the story, the purpose of the story, just by imagining some of those details, even if they're not exactly right. So imagination can help us better understand the story, better connect with the story, and of course, better connect with the characters who are part of it. And so that brings us to gospel stories. They provide a general outline of what happened and what was said, but they cannot possibly include all the details. And adding some of the details can bring those stories to life, even if the details aren't exactly right. And a few extra details can help bring the characters into sharper focus. We get to know some of the disciples a little better just by imagining their personality, or can amplify the interaction of Jesus with the crowd or the disciples among themselves and make the stories more real for us. Now, obviously, we've got to keep our imagination in check. We don't want to start imagining all sorts of crazy things, but I don't think that's likely to happen. The Gospels provide a basic outline of the story. So there might be a story about Jesus who's concerned about a man with leprosy and who attends to that man with great care. Well, we don't want to imagine Jesus getting mad at the man, or we don't want to imagine Jesus ignoring the man and walking away. But that's not what the story says, so we're not likely to do that. That would really get us off track if we imagine Jesus, treating this poor man poorly. But that's not what the story says. The story says Jesus cared for him and had compassion for him. So that's what we're imagining. So we just have to make sure we're kind of following the basic outline of the story, but we don't worry about some of the extraneous details. Those extra details just can help enrich our experience of that story. So maybe some practical tips on imagining, and many of you probably have some suggestions too, and these are just some ideas I put together. First, I'd say imagining takes practice. It doesn't come automatically to all of us, to everybody. I sort of compare it to singing. Some people assume that everyone knows how to sing, and I say, no. When you ask me to sing, it's like asking me to play the trombone. I don't know how to do either. So I'm going to have to practice, and you have to make it real easy for me. So imagining can be the same type of thing. It's like drawing a picture with pastel chalk. If you say to some retreat, okay, now imagine this scene. It's like asking them, okay, draw the scene with this pastel chalk. They might be able to sketch out a few things, but it takes practice, and they might not be real good at it at first. And when we're drawing, maybe we don't do an entire landscape. Maybe we just draw a flower or some grass, and little by little we gain some practice in it, and we develop some skill. And I think the same thing can be said with imagining. I think in the old days, people had more practice using their imagination. Verbal storytelling was more common back then, and verbal storytelling requires the use of more imagination. It prompts us to fill in the details, to imagine what it looks like and imagine what it sounds like. Today, there's less verbal storytelling, and more often we're watching the television or watching movies, and that requires some imagination, but not as much. Right? We don't need to imagine what the characters look like, because there they are. We can see what they look like. And we don't need to imagine, their interaction or what they're saying to one another, because It's right there. We can see it and we can hear it. So our imagination isn't as stretched as much. But we do have to imagine some things. We might not even think about it. We have to imagine heat and cold, right? If we see a winter scene, we, in our imagination, feel the cold, or the smells and the taste. They don't come through. Our imaginations sort of kick in automatically to fill in some of those details. A fellow Jesuit was once watching a movie about a man in the wilderness, and he built a big roaring fire. And he was describing how he was drawn into the scene and could feel the heat and smell the smoke. And then suddenly he realized the television was on fire. And no wonder he was smelling the smoke. It had caught fire, so he had to turn off the TV. But even when the television isn't on fire, we can imagine the scene and the smell and the smoke and the heat and all that. And we all do that sort of automatically. Plus, we need to imagine what the people are feeling or what they're thinking. That can be sort of conveyed or depicted by the artists that are producing this television show or the movie, but still we have to imagine what they're feeling. Reading novels is another way of engaging our imagination, and that engages more of our imagination, right? Because we have to picture the scene as it's described by the author. And some authors are very good at describing a scene, but even so, we have to use some imagination. We have to connect with it and picture it in our mind. Imagining gospel stories can present some special challenges. Many scripture passages provide only a few prompts. As you might notice, they don't always provide a very vivid picture. And often painting a picture isn't the primary objective of the gospel writers. They're not trying to describe all the details. They're not novelists. And sometimes the gospel writer is trying to make a theological point, or just trying to focus on the dialogue or what Jesus said. And that's great, but it leaves a lot unsaid about what the scene looks like and the characters involved. You know, it's not uncommon for a scripture passage to begin with, Jesus addressed the crowds, and then quoting Jesus. We say, okay, where is he? And what crowds? And what do they look like? And where are they sitting? And I've noticed that especially in Luke with the parables. It's often, Jesus said, and you go, okay, where is he? It would be helpful for me to know, how did he get there? And who are the crowds he's speaking to? But often the gospel writers aren't concerned about all those details. But filling in the details can be helpful for us. But it takes energy and it takes attention. And it's not always easy. And I find too, when you're tired or distracted, it's especially difficult to kind of begin to fill in details of a story that is just kind of outlined by the gospel writers. And I think imagining can be elusive. And I don't know if that's your experience too, but it's like trying to hold a butterfly in your hand. You know, you're imagining a scene, it's like a butterfly landing on your hand and you're drawn into it. And then all of a sudden the butterfly flies away and you've lost it. You know, you had it there for a minute and now it's gone. And try as you might, you can't hold on to it. So it's not uncommon in the process of contemplation to be distracted. What's that sound out there? Oh yeah, okay, back to my contemplation, and then try to refocus and get back into it. And I think it's unusual, at least it's unusual for me, to be drawn into an entire contemplation for an extended period of time. You know, 40 minutes, I'm just wrapped up in this contemplation. It'd be nice, it happens once in a while, but it's pretty uncommon. I think more often it's just snippets of a brief reflection, and then pick it up later and just gather another snippet. And I think that can be helpful, even if it isn't drawing us in for an extended period of time. I just remember once doing a contemplation of John sending two of his disciples to follow Jesus, and the disciples asked, "Where do you stay?" And Jesus said, "Come and see." Great passage in John's Gospel, and I was a third the disciple with these two disciples, and so we went, and the other disciples did all this talking. I stood in the back, and Jesus was interacting with them. And then at just one point, Jesus kind of looks over to me with an expression on his face like, so what's your story? And that was just one little snippet, but that I reflected on that the whole retreat. I was like, okay, there's something there. There was a little connection there. There's something to think about there. And so it was profitable. Again, it wasn't a whole extended contemplation, but it was just a little snippet that was helpful. Our imaginations are not often, 5 minutes? Okay. Are not often multifaceted. They're more often than not, they're pretty focused. So we can be attentive to the scenery, or we can't be attentive to the scenery and all the characters and the dialogue all at the same time. We might just capture a bit of the conversation between Jesus and the disciples. Or if we're imagining, Jesus curing the 10 lepers, we might focus on the dialogue and just have a vague sense of the setting, or we might just focus more on the setting and just have a vague sense of the conversation, but we don't necessarily focus on everything all at once. I think often enough our contemplations are pretty focused. We pick up a piece of the scene or the event that's happening. And I think too, good prompts can help. When I lead retreats, I often tell gospel stories and fill in some of the details of those stories just to help the retreatants move into the reflection more completely. And some retreatants find that helpful. It just spurs their imagination. And some of you may have seen the video series, The Chosen, which is wonderfully creative and imaginative and depicts gospel scenes. And those too can provide a prompt. We get a sense of what's going on. A depiction of Peter and his wife and their conversation. And we never thought about Peter's wife, but that's a nice conversation, and that can prompt us. I think just watching an episode can be a prayer period in itself, but maybe we watch a show and then that just helps feed our imagination, and that can be helpful. So in summary, I think that imagining scenes from Scripture takes practice. Often we just get a bit of the conversation or a sense of the setting, but that's enough. That's enough for us to connect with the story a little bit. And imagining can also be easier if we've got some prompts that can give us some idea of what the setting looks like or give us some idea of the characters involved. All right, well, I'm running out of time. I'll just say a little bit about putting ourselves in the scene. And I think that's a fun exercise, but it doesn't always work, and sometimes it's helpful, sometimes not. When we contemplate, we put ourselves in the scene in some ways, but often we're at a distance. We're watching the other characters. We're not a character ourselves, but one of the things we can do is put ourselves into the scene and become one of the characters. And I think that can be helpful. First, if we connect with that character, right? So we don't try to imagine ourselves as Pilate unless we really can relate to Pilate. And if we're really feeling like Pilate, okay, we can put ourselves in that. But otherwise, we're not connecting with that character. Or I even think of Jairus, the synagogue leader. It's more difficult for me to connect with that character because I'm not married and I don't have a daughter. So I don't know what that experience is like. So I can kind of imagine what it would be like to be married and have a daughter. But it's more helpful to me just to imagine being one of the single guys, because then I could relate to their experience. And it's also, we can't think about it too much. I think for me, being a character, if my brain is thinking, wait a second, you don't live back there in first century Palestine, you weren't one of the disciples, what are you doing out there? Okay, then it's not going to work because I'm raising all sorts of objectives. But if you just kind of forget about the objectives and put yourself in the scene, it can be pretty helpful. And one summer I imagined Jesus in his dinner with Martha and Mary, one of my favorite gospel stories. And so the other disciples were heading back to Galilee, and Jesus and I went to Bethany to visit with Martha and Mary. And as we walked along, Jesus and I had a wonderful conversation. And he was telling me about the Pharisees and his admiration for the Pharisees, but also his discouragement and frustration with them. And I could relate to that, and I was talking to him about that. And it was a great conversation. And then we got to Bethany, and Jesus gave a talk, and then he and Mary went to go tend to people who were sick in need of healing. And Martha and I went off to prepare dinner, and I had a great conversation with Mary, or Martha, as I'm peeling vegetables or whatever she was asking me to do. And I could ask her about how she got to know Jesus and what her experience of Jesus was like. And it's a wonderful conversation. Now, of course, none of that's in the gospel stories, but I think that's okay. We know Jesus walked along roadways and had conversations with his disciples, and he had followers like Martha who met him at some point and was attracted to him. So imagining having a conversation with Jesus or with Martha can be very helpful, even if those details aren't part of the gospel story. They can make those stories more real to us. Okay, well, I've talked a long time. It's time, I think, for a little break, and then we'll reconvene in what, about 5 or 10 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. So get your coffee quick, and we'll reconvene. Thank you. Great, thank you. So in this session, we're going to talk about the meditation on the two standards. And I've got to admit, I find this a challenging meditation, so I was looking forward to the opportunity to reflect on it a little bit. And I think it can be very fruitful, but there are some challenges. And I think for me it's helpful to identify what the primary focus of the meditation is, and then maybe what some adaptations might be made to make it more helpful for us in our own time. So I'm going to just give an overview of the image, talk a little bit about feudalism, which informs that image, and I think was important for St. Ignatius. Talk about some of the challenges that the image presents for ourselves, and then talk what I think is the key focus of that meditation, and that is our relationship with Jesus. Talk about Satan and how Satan fits into that meditation, and then talk about unity and service, which are sort of the outcomes or desires that arise out of that meditation. So just a quick overview. The meditation suggests an image, and Jesus stands on a plain outside of Jerusalem with a number of followers who are gathered under his banner or under his standard. And then a group of followers have joined his company. And then Satan stands on a plain outside of Babylon, surrounded by his own group of followers under his standard. And the meditation proposes a question. Well, which group do you want to join? You want to go over there with Jesus or Satan? Is that your preference? And it's, of course, inspired. We're inspired by Jesus, and that's the connection we want to make. We desire to follow him. And the meditation suggests, well, characteristics of following Jesus are spiritual poverty and humility and service. And the characteristics of following Satan are desiring riches and honors. Okay, so why the image? Why not just reflect on virtues and vices and sort of a examination of conscience and leave it go at that? Decide what's a good thing to do and a bad thing to do and be done with it. Well, that's not the main point. I think the main point is connecting more closely with Jesus. And the image can help us do that. And that's why St. Ignatius suggested it. Images can capture something about Jesus that descriptions alone can't do. It can help us better understand and connect with Jesus. And of course, there's other images in the spiritual exercises that St. Ignatius suggests. There's the call of the king at the end of the first week of the spiritual exercises, an image of Jesus as a king. Or there's the image of the Trinity in the first week, looking out over all the earth and said, oh, what a mess it is down there. But they're worried about the world down below. That's an image. And then, of course, there's all sorts of images that come from gospel stories that help us picture Jesus as a teacher or a prophet or a healer. And all of those images are important. And the images never capture the full reality of Jesus, but can capture something that's important. And those images, more than just giving us an understanding, can also engage our heart. We can be drawn to Jesus in that image. And it helps us foster a deeper relationship with him. So I think a lot of the background to this image for St. Ignatius was feudalism. A feudal lord was a powerful image for Ignatius. Feudalism was of course, common in medieval Europe, and it was at a time when there weren't strong national authorities. And so it was a time of danger, and there would be bandits and marauders that would threaten local towns and local leaders. And so vassals or knights would pledge loyalty to the local duke or lord in the area and serve that lord with honor and courage and faithfulness, and provide protection to the lord against some of the threats that were out there. And of course, vassals were often tenant farmers on the land owned by the lord, and they would get their economic sustenance through the goodness of the lord, would provide them with some support. But I think it's important to realize that it really is an image of relationship, a relationship of a vassal and a lord, a person who's dedicated to a particular individual, who's connected with a particular individual, and admires that individual and wants to serve that individual. And so I think that's an important image for St. Ignatius. He himself was a knight. He himself, pledged loyalty to certain authorities, dukes and the nobles in the area. And so even though feudalism had begun to disappear by the time of St. Ignatius, that was still a powerful image for him. And in his view, to serve a lord or a noble with courage and conviction was a source of honor. That's an important part of his self-image. So he suggests choosing Jesus as our leader and following him and pledging to serve him. And that's a powerful image for St. Ignatius. And so I think it's important just to recognize that background and what he sees as valuable in that image. But of course, for us, feudalism is not part of our experience, and we're not drawn to it so much. Most of us don't pledge loyalty and service to anybody, and we don't see ourselves as dependent upon a lord who takes care of us. And there's aspects of feudalism that really aren't part of the image. We don't have to worry about those so much. It's an economic system we don't like, because the vassal can't own the land or whatever. Well, that's not part of the image, so we can dispense with that. And the military angle on there isn't prominent in this. I think it's more prominent in the Call of the King, and so we have to figure out what to do with the military imagery there in that. But that's not so much part of this. But I think it's important to kind of recognize some features of this that might not click with us immediately. So loyalty was, I think, very important for St. Ignatius, but it may be not something we resonate with so strongly. It's not that we're not loyal, but loyalty implies that Jesus has enemies, or that the person we're loyal to has enemies, and so we take a stand against those enemies. Well, that might not be the way we view the world. So loyalty, we want to be loyal, but we don't really think of defending Jesus against his enemies. That's not kind of our image. Sacrifice was big for Ignatius, and I think in itself was attractive to him. It's like people during Lent, the harder the penance, the better they like it, They want to make a sacrifice. And but for some of us, that in itself isn't so important. We need to know why we make the sacrifice, and the reason behind making the sacrifice is more important to us than the fact we make the sacrifice. And of course, part of the image is dependence of the vassal on the Lord. And there's that's sort of part of the meditation too. And so we'd have to think about that. And all of that kind of informs one's self-identity. And that might not be the way we understand ourselves as a loyal servant who's making sacrifices and dependent. Those features might not be resonate so much with us. For us, the work itself that we're called to do is more important. What is it that Jesus is inviting us to do? And that's what we gravitate toward. And then, we'll make sacrifices to do that, but it's the work we're looking at. And also, I think it's important for us to recognize a unique contribution. So we're not just one of 10,000 people all doing the same thing, but we all have some independence and we make some unique contributions. and still responding to Jesus' invitation in the midst of that. And I think it's possible to reframe the image, and I'll suggest some ways to do that. But I think it's just good to recognize that there's sort of an angle that St. Ignatius takes that may not exactly resonate with our own, so we have to make some adaptations. And I think it's also important to realize leadership isn't particularly appealing to us today. Often enough, we're disillusioned or cynical about leaders, and with good reason. Political leaders, business leaders, religious leaders. And so they've failed us, they've disappointed us. And so having a leader doesn't necessarily resonate immediately with us. And I think there's been times in our history when leadership was more prominent and important. Stories of the 1920s and President Franklin Roosevelt calling the people to make sacrifices and work together because of a common problem of the Depression or the World War. And people responded to that, and they looked to the president as a leader. I don't think that's as common now. We don't look to our political leaders for leadership, and we're not looking to them to give us marching orders. And leadership can be problematic in the business world too, and I think it's good just to be aware of that, because serving Jesus, working for Jesus, sometimes people don't see the work that they're doing as particularly important or particularly noble. And even if they do have an appreciation of their own work, say that they're, work in a health profession, and that they see that as a vocation for themselves, it's not, sometimes it's not connected with any particular leader. And in fact, they might see the administrator or the leader of the organization as being problematic. They're getting in the way of the good work I want to do, so I'll just try to work around them. And so that's often the experience of people with leaders today. And so I think it's just good to be aware and to reflect on our own experience of leadership. Do we resonate with leaders? And I think having some sense of a leader with whom we might resonate or connect with can help us in this, because it's really an invitation to see Jesus as a leader for us. And so we might think of examples that we can connect to. I can think of in a school setting where the principal can really serve as an inspiring leader, and we're all working on this together and we're going to make sacrifices, or a director of a skilled care facility who's really a good leader in inspiring others to share in this work of caring for the patients there, and who's willing to make sacrifices themselves. I think all of that, those can be powerful images, can help us with this meditation. So like I say, I think the focus of this meditation on the two standards is really our relationship with Jesus, strengthening that connection, helping us desire to grow in unity with Jesus and a desire to serve him. And I think that's consistent with the thrust of the second week of the exercises, where this meditation is included. In the second week, the constant colloquy is to ask to be able to follow and imitate Jesus more closely. So it's the whole week is devoted to growing in unity with Jesus. And I think that is the primary thrust, or the most helpful thrust, of this meditation. So it's not primarily about knowing the deceits of Satan, or becoming more detached from riches and honors, or desiring poverty and humility. Those can be secondary desires, but I think it's helpful to put the primary desire, the reason for those other things, is because we want to grow closer to Jesus and be more united with him. Ed Knerk is a Jesuit, a spiritual writer, and a retreat director who now lives here in St. Louis, and he once wrote something about the importance of desires in the spiritual exercises, and saying that desires lead us to God. And authentic desires can be found in our hearts, and the spiritual exercises can help uncover those desires and help foster and grow those desires. And I think that's an objective of this meditation, to grow in our desire for union with Jesus and desire to serve him. We're inspired with him. We want to join his company. We want to serve with him. And it's really a sense of vocation, that we have something important to contribute to this effort, and we want to join Jesus in doing that. I was just thinking of a different way of framing the meditation that might pull out some of those strands is, well, Imagine Jesus going to Busch Stadium on a Saturday afternoon and inviting all the friends and followers who are inspired by him to join together and listen to him speak. And he's down there on the field, and he's got a microphone, and he's speaking to the crowd. And he invites all of us to join in this important work of the kingdom right here in St. Louis. And I think that image can be helpful, so we don't have to think about a plane outside Jerusalem. We could think of Busch Stadium, which might be easier to imagine and more connected with our own experience. Okay, I can imagine going down to Busch Stadium and listening to Jesus talk. And then we look around, and who's gathered there? Well, there's teachers and bus drivers and firefighters and parents and children and all sorts of people who are gathered together, people we've run into, people we know, gathered who are inspired by Jesus and desire to serve him. And they do it in a variety of different ways. So it's not everyone doing the same thing. Everyone has a unique contribution to make, but is inspired by that same call. So it's a different way of thinking about the image that might pick up some resonances with our own experience, our own desires. Okay, what about the standard of Satan? Well, I think in this meditation it's important to recognize that the crowd gathered around Satan are demons, not people. People are less likely to form a connection with Satan. We're less likely to say, boy, I really like that Satan. I think I'm going to join his company. Or anybody making a retreat is probably not at that stage in their life. Maybe, but I think that's unlikely. So people fall victim to temptations of Satan. And so the choice is really, do we unite ourselves with Jesus, or do we allow ourselves to fall victim to the temptations of Satan? And so that's sort of the choice we have to make. It's demons that are invited to do Satan's work. And in this meditation, Satan sends them out and says, tempt people with desires for riches and honors. And those two temptations were really important for Ignatius. And obviously they're important to Jesus too. Jesus spoke about honors and riches too. But that really resonated with St. Ignatius. And we remember stories, about how, especially honors played a part in his life. Like he had his leg broken a second time because it was crooked, and he wanted to look good, so he had to break it a second time and reset it, and that's vanity, and that's, looking for honors. And then there's that story of him encountering the Moor on the road, and this individual insulted the Virgin Mary, and Ignatius wanted to kill him, and fortunately he didn't. He had the donkey decide whether to go after the Moor or go into town, and the donkey said, I don't want any of that, I'm going into town. So that's where he went. But that was all about the Virgin Mother's honor, and his own honor were insulted, and that's just a powerful motivator for him. So he recognized how honors and riches can be a temptation. So for some people, riches and honors aren't the only obstacle, and it might not be the primary obstacle for them. And I think that's good to recognize. Riches and honors probably factor into all of our lives, but for some, other things are getting in the way, like resentment or fear or envy or self-doubt. There's all sorts of obstacles that the evil spirit can put in the way. And I think that's how this meditation connects with Ignatius' advice on discernment. How to recognize spirits moving in our lives, and to recognize what obstacles the evil spirit is putting in our way, and it prompting sadness or discouragement or hopelessness that disturbs our souls and makes it less possible for us to form a connection with Jesus. So I think, certainly Satan's part in this image or this meditation is important, but I think we can make it broader than just riches and honors. There's all sorts of things that could stand in the way of our relationship. Okay, I want to talk just briefly about unity with Jesus and how important that is, but how we might understand that in this context. We seek to be received under the standard of Jesus. We want to be united with him. And Ignatius says we are united with him through spiritual poverty and through bearing insults, so that we imitate Jesus in his poverty and his bearing insults. And of course, unity with Jesus is one of the motivations for accepting poverty. And for St. Ignatius, that was one of the motivations for having Jesuits take vows of poverty. There's lots of reasons for that, but one of them was so we're more closely reunited with Jesus and his experience. We choose to live simply and not accumulate wealth so that we more closely united with him. And I think it's important to understand why Jesus chose, and to understand that he's choosing not to be attached to worldly goods so that he can be of greater service, so he can help people. And I think understanding that sort of detachment for the same reasons for ourselves can be helpful. Jesus did not live in destitution, right? And he wasn't overly abstemious. In fact, he had a reputation for enjoying a good or a glass of wine. So I think we have to understand his approach to attachment. He didn't avoid those things, but he wasn't attached to them either. He knew how to enjoy a good meal, but sometimes he was in bed. Sometimes he slept out in the cold. And that's because he was more focused on other things. He wasn't worried about taking care of his particular needs. And so we too can enjoy God's gifts, but we want to seek the same detachment, that other things become more important to us than riches. And the same thing can be said about dishonor. Jesus was honored by some people and dishonored by other people. It wasn't a continual experience of dishonor. And Jesus' objective wasn't to be dishonored by as many people as possible. That wasn't what he was trying to do. He was trying to bring the good news and invite people to join the kingdom of God and to know about God's care and love for them and to bring healing and hope to them. That was his objective. And he did that whether that brought him honor or dishonor. And so he was indifferent to that. He wasn't attached to honor. And so I think it's kind of that same motivation that can motivate us, that we're not seeking just to be dishonored for the sake of being dishonored. We're not attached to honors, and we do what needs to be done, whether it brings us honor or not. And that's kind of the motivation. And of course, detachment and dishonor can help us connect with Jesus, but there are other things that connect with Jesus as well. Just spending time with Jesus and sharing our life with Jesus and learning about his life, that can help foster the connection. So I think the objective of the meditation is to help us grow in our connection with Jesus. And we do that by sharing his life and experience in some way, but also we do that in other ways too. We share in his work, we share in his life, and we share our lives with him. All right, so I think all of those are part of it. And the same thing can be said of service, and I'll conclude there because I know I'm running out of time. The meditation on the two standards prompts us to be united with Jesus and to serve with him. And service is important, and it's important to see our life in that way, that our lives are lives of service. And we're not just down here on earth killing time, trying to avoid getting in trouble. No, it's more than that. We're trying to do something, right? We're trying to be of service. We're trying to help people. Our lives have meaning and purpose and direction. And St. Ignatius says, well, here's what you can do. You can spread sacred doctrine, you can attract others to spiritual poverty, and you can lead others to desire insults, okay? And so that's kind of the marching orders that Jesus gives his followers. Well, all of that, of course, is a spiritual ministry. And that's fine, but I think we can broaden our understanding of spiritual ministry. If spiritual ministry is what we want to engage, that's great, but it's more than spreading sacred doctrine. I would call it, helping people discover God and develop a relationship with God. That's what we're hoping to do. Doctrine, yeah, that's important too, but the relationship with God is the most important. Help them grow in love and gratitude and service and reconciliation, and to recognize the importance of all those things. That's what spiritual ministry includes. It's not just limited to doctrine and detachment. There's more to spiritual ministry than that. And many people are not engaged full-time in spiritual ministry. In fact, they might not do much spiritual ministry at all, but that's only one type of service. So I think it's got to be broader. When we see Jesus' invitation to serve with him, we see it's not just spiritual ministry, it's love. Just go out and love the people God has put into your life. That's the way you serve God. That's how you serve under the banner of Christ, is to go out and love your family and love the people God's put into your life. Taking the kids to soccer practice, or having a cup of coffee with a friend. That's love, and that's part of your invitation. Now go out and do that. Go have coffee with your friend. And Ignatius might not like it because involves a lot of sacrifice, but that's all right. Even if it doesn't involve sacrifice, go out and do it, because that's what we're called to do. And go and serve in whatever way it is that you serve. If you're a UPS driver, well, deliver those packages and try to get them to the right spot and on time if you can. And if you're a firefighter, well, go out and care for people on that emergency call. That's your job. That's what you're invited to do. So to see this invitation of service, yeah, spreading doctrine and encouraging indifference, all that's important, but there's all sorts of things that we're invited to do. And then that's part of the invitation of this meditation as well. Okay, I've talked long enough, so I'll end there. Thank you very much.